We're going to look at Puritanism now, because Puritanism gave New England a lot of its culture and has given America a lot of our culture and our values. The Puritans were the dominant group in the early settlers of New England. And they had an unusually strong influence on American culture and values, as I've said. Uh, we hear a lot about religious freedom when we talk about these early settlers of New England, but that can be misleading. Um, it meant freedom for them, not freedom for other people. The freedom for them to practice their religion, but they were not willing to grant that freedom to others. So it was not religious tolerance, as the term is usually used. Um, the Puritans distinguished between bad freedom and good freedom. Bad freedom is what the Indians had. They did whatever they wanted. They were unrestrained. Good freedom meant following the rules, the freedom for those who read the Bible, who conform to the Puritans' idea of what a good person and what a good society should be like. So it's not unrestrained freedom. Um, in theory, on paper, the Puritans had a separation of church and state, and we know that their ministers could not be, political leaders of towns, for example, but that was really so that they would have more time to devote to their religious activities. Although on paper they had this separation, in reality, not so much. Um, they had town meetings, they had local elections, but only church members could vote in those elections. So clearly, the Puritans expected that they would dominate not only their church, but the towns and colonies in which they lived. Now, Puritan theology is based on the teachings of John Calvin, a 16th century Protestant reformer who centered his activity in Geneva. He was French and had a very hard time in France because that's a Catholic country, and found his home in Geneva, Switzerland. Calvin uh, believed in predestination, and the Puritans were Calvinists. That would include the Pilgrims who settled Plymouth and the Puritans who settled Massachusetts Bay. And others such as the early settlers of Connecticut and Rhode Island as well. Um, they believed that from the moment of conception, God chose whether we would go to heaven or hell, and there wasn't a thing that individuals could do about it. Now, they taught that God began way back with Adam and Eve. God began with a covenant of works. A covenant is a sacred agreement between God and people. And works are good deeds, good works, good deeds. The Catholic Church teaches that faith and good works both contribute to salvation, in other words, to going to heaven. Uh, the Puritans in Calvin had a different view. He said, although God began by rewarding people for the good deeds that they did, Adam and Eve sinned. And then God, in his anger, said, no more covenant of works. And he replaced it with a covenant of grace. Now, the thing you need to know about grace is that it's freely given. You can't earn it. God graces some people and not others, according to Calvin, and there's nothing that humans can do to earn that. So God elects or chooses a few for salvation the moment they're conceived. They're destined for salvation, and since this happens before they're born, that is referred to as predestination. In other words, their destination, where they will ultimately go is decided before they're born. Everybody else is damned. Everybody else will go to hell. Now, uh, Calvin believed that the elect are those predestined for heaven, and they're a fairly small group. And the damned are a much larger group. Now, it's very important to notice the way this diagram is drawn. There is no middle ground. We know that in everyday experience, there aren't people who are totally good or totally bad. We're all sort of a mixture. We all have good qualities. We all have not so good qualities. But in this view of humans, there is no middle ground. You go to one place or the other, and most of the people will go to the other, to hell. Now, if you are a Calvinist believer, then the most urgent question of your life is, which of these two groups am I in? That is critically important. Now, here's the bad news, according to Calvin. Only God knows for sure. We can never know God's will perfectly. But there are signs of election. If God has chosen you to go to heaven, predestined you to do that, then there are signs that will show. If you pray, if you read the Bible, if you go to church, if you live a simple, sober life, uh, is it more likely that you have already been elected to go to heaven? Yes. Now, does this mean that praying and reading the Bible, etc., will earn you a place in heaven? No. Calvin says no. But it's a sign of what God has probably already decided before you were even born. That's the way he would formulate it. Now, Puritans were notorious for being nervous about where they were going to go. Uh, Now, they developed secular signs of election. Secular means non-religious. And they believed that good or bad fortune might be signs that they were either elected or damned. So, for example, let's say your neighbor's barn burns down, but yours is spared. Well, God is, shining His grace on you. This is a very good sign that you may be elected to go to heaven. But the following year, how are you going to react if your barn burns down and your neighbor's barn is spared? Uh-oh. This will make you anxious. This will create doubt in your mind about whether you have really been elected. So the Puritans are looking for signs in every kind of human event. Uh, we've defeated the Indians. God has blessed us. Uh, or they have defeated us. What have we done to displease God? And are we really among the elect? They live their lives in this state of uncertainty. So they explored every detail of their lives in great details. They wrote personal journals. And we have a lot of these, and historians are grateful that we can look into the minds and hearts of Puritans from these journals that they left behind. They were also interested in keeping up appearances, even if they had their own personal doubts about whether they were elect. They certainly didn't want to look bad in the eyes of their neighbors, of the other members of the church. So they put a tremendous emphasis on looking good. And this is a trait that is often identified with American culture, because so many of these characteristics are transported from New England into American culture generally. You're being asked to read an article called Still Puritan After All These Years. Read that article and you will get a better example of the sort of thing that I'm talking about. Now, Calvin's ideas of predestination became secularized. And that means that what was religious became non-religious or secular. Let me illustrate that. If you were among the elect, were you likely to be hardworking or lazy? Well, that's a no-brainer. You'd be hardworking, right? Would you be thrifty and save your money, or would you just waste it foolishly? Well, again, pretty easy question. Would you be sober or drunk? The answer is obvious. Would you live a simple life, or would you put all your energy into luxuries and getting extravagant things? Well, uh, if you had already been blessed with God's grace, then these are the kind of qualities here: hard work, ambition, thrift, sobriety, simplicity. Those are the kinds of qualities that would show in you, and then they in turn would indicate that you were one of the good guys. You were elect. Uh, Now, what happens over time is that this division of people into two groups uh, comes to be the way that we Americans often look at each other and look at certain events in our society. So the religious version is that the elect are separate from the damned. But let's just change the labels: the rich and the poor. Which group has God blessed with more abundance, with more grace? Well, the Calvinists would be likely to say the rich. And I have to point out that this goes directly against what the Bible says. Uh, Jesus valued the poor and believed that they had a far greater chance for salvation than did the rich. So in a way, Calvin is taking the Bible message and turning it upside down. Uh, do we apply this in other ways? What about workers and unemployed people? Is there something wrong with the unemployed? A lot of Americans seem to think so. Is it really their fault? Are they really lazy? If they had the qualities that we workers had, wouldn't they have jobs too? Questions like that. You see this with the old Western movies where the good guys have the white hats and the bad guys have the black hats. There's this urge, this drive in American culture to separate people into the good and the bad. And that, it has been argued by a lot of cultural commentators, goes all the way back to the Puritans, who get their basic ideas from John Calvin. This is our version. No one ever goes to a basketball game or a football game simply saying, I don't care who wins. I just want to see the beauty of a well-played game. You don't get that. You are on one side or the other, and there is no middle ground. Now, I'm kind of, having fun with this. I wouldn't push this too hard. Uh, on the other hand, can you imagine other cultures, let's say Zen Buddhists, uh, engaging in a fierce football rivalry with the Taoists? You don't see this sort of thing in Eastern religions. This is very Western, and I might add, very Calvinist, and also very American. Now, this brings up the topic of the American dream. That's a subject that we'll come back to many times throughout the course. Um, the Puritans came to New England uh, to support the religious health, well-being of their children. They wanted their children not to be corrupted by influences in England or elsewhere in the world. They had this vision that they would create a city on a hill, a model city, a model community, that they would teach a lesson to everybody else about the best way to live our lives, the best way to set up a society. Uh, they had a sense that they were in charge of their own destiny. But not, doesn't contradict predestination. They couldn't control their whether they go to heaven or hell, but they could control the kind of community that they created. And if they did well with this, that was probably a sign that they had all been predestined to go to heaven. But they saw this doing this as a community and not as individuals. Now, this raises the question about what they thought about a free market economy, a capitalist economy? Well, the answer is they were ambivalent toward it. Ambivalence means you're pulled in both directions at once. You see one argument on one hand, but the opposing argument on the other hand. Let me give you an example of that here. Wealth is a secular sign of election. If you're wealthy, that might mean that you're one of God's elect. On the other hand, materialism is evil. If all you can think about is material things, then you are not going to be very focused on the things of God. So is prosperity good? Is wealth good? Well, it just depends. Now, in Puritan society, it would be a big mistake to see this as an early democracy. It's not really that. There's not the kind of emphasis on equality that shows up in later American history. Um, this was a very ordered society. There were lots of rules. For example, in courtship, that's kind of an old-fashioned word now, but it means the process of meeting your mate in marriage and learning whether this is the right person for you. Well, courtship was something that families got very involved with. For one reason, in an agricultural society, a marriage was not just among two people, it was among two families, and there were economic, financial implications to all of this. Um, they had some odd customs surrounding courtship. They believed very strongly that marriage ought to be forever, and they didn't want people to rush into it carelessly. And they wanted them to know if they were physically compatible with each other. So they did something called bundling. They would put them in bed together and wrap them up and put a bundling board in between them. And from the neck up, they could be intimate, but not from the neck down. Now, what happened at night? Who knows? Um, they also believed in the principle of submission, that you had levels in society, hierarchies in society. So uh, children should submit to parents. The servants should submit to masters. Uh, the the uh, the feeble-minded should submit to the clever, and so on. And they thought this way. So there were levels of society, and each person had a role, and you had to know your station in life, where you belonged. They even had laws about dressing in ways that stepped out of your accepted social position. They were called sumptuary laws. So if you were not a gentleman, it was against the law to dress like a gentleman. You had to know your place in society. Strangers were regarded with suspicion. If you lived apart from the village, if you weren't part of the church, you were going to get some tough questions, and you might very well be expelled from your New England town. Now, I want to close this with a few comments about two major wars that New Englanders had with Native Americans. The first one was the Pequot War, 1637-38. There were conflicts over the fur trade, a competition between Indians and English settlers. Things escalated, and the English at one point massacred several hundred Pequot Indians. I've seen the figure 600 to 700, and this included women, children, old men. Now you might say, how does this square with Christianity? Well, the commander's assessment, the Puritan commander's assessment was, thus did the Lord judge among the heathen. So we didn't do this, the Lord did it. The Lord was with us, the Lord was behind us, and this was his punishment of them for believing in false gods. That was their take on this. Now, an even larger war was King Philip's War, 1675 and 76. And the biggest issue here was the expansion of this growing English population into lands that were controlled by Native Americans. This is the bloodiest war in American history, including the Civil War and every other war. if you base it on the percentages of people who were killed. This was, the population, of course, was much, much smaller, but the percentages who died were higher than in any other war in American history. Um, the Puritans' interpretation of their victory was predictable. Once again, God's providence triumphed over the wilderness and savagery of the natives. Um, so the Puritans could be anxious about their own salvation, but they could be very arrogant in judging the salvation or lack thereof of other people. And their treatment of Native Americans is nothing to be proud of.